Bonjour, bienvenue. Mon nom est Michael Orsini. Je suis professeur agrégé à l'École d'études politiques. Welcome to the discussion and book launch featuring the work of my colleague and friend Jackie Best. Je suis ravi d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui pour discuter le nouveau livre de professeur Best. Nous aurons l'occasion d'en discuter en profondeur avec nos collègues Randy Germain et William Walters de l'Université Carleton et Gordon Betcherman de ESAPI, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I'd be remiss if I did not say that I appreciate the irony of talking about failure with one of the most successful people I know. Jackie's work has earned widespread praise and accolades, and deservedly so. Her work is firmly anchored in the main theoretical debates in her subfield, but it's so much more. And this is why I think she's read as widely as she is. There's something I think for everyone, for folks interested in the sociology of expertise and the role of international organizations and constructivist approaches to policy, and heaven forbid, actor network theory. And this is no accident. It's a product, I think, of Jackie's careful appreciation for and integration of insights from a range of disciplinary places. Careful and judicious because what Jackie's work demonstrates quite vividly is that the vital questions related to global governance demand, indeed command, the mobilization of a range of concepts and ideas if we are to fully capture and appreciate the confounding paradoxes that she outlines in her book, The Confounding Paradoxes of Global Governance. Je vais laisser la parole à Jackie pour introduire our guest speakers who are going to speak to her work. So I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for the introduction, very generous introduction. And also I should mention that Michael was one of quite a number of people who helped, and in his case, cast his keen editor's eye on the introduction of this book and helped make it tight. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the other members of the panel and also to introduce them briefly. And I think the order we're going to go in, I'll start with Gordon Betcherman, Professor of Development Studies and in the Institute of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa, both a scholar and a practitioner of international development, including 11 years at the World Bank, and most recently lead author. I've actually brought the recent publications of my panelists too. I figure it shouldn't just be about my book. So recently lead author of the World Bank Development Report on Jobs, and I think you were saying there's also an Oxford University Press follow-up volume coming out of that. Randall Germain, Professor in Political Science at Carleton, and I think one of Canada's best known IPE scholars, particularly in the area of international financial governance. And here his most recent book, Global Politics and Financial Governance. And finally, William Walters, Professor in Political Science and Sociology at Carleton, and I think one of the most original thinkers working at the intersection of global politics and social theory today. And his most recent book, Governmentality, Critical Encounters. So I'm absolutely delighted and honored that they've all agreed to participate today and to say something about my book. Now, before I turn the floor over to them, I did want to give you a quick overview of the book that we're launching today, because I don't expect everyone to have already read it. And that way, as they say their particular comments, you'll have some sense anyway of the bigger picture. This book was quite a long time coming. When I look back at it, I actually started some of the initial thinking about it even just as the last book was coming out in 2005. Academic books are a beast, I have to say. The last book was on the history of international financial governance, right up to and just past the Asian financial crisis of 1998. And soon after that crisis, I started to get interested in trying to understand some of the changes I was seeing, particularly initially at the IMF, which is the organization that I had been studying. And suddenly the IMF was talking about ownership, was talking about poverty. In fact, one of my first interviews at the IMF with a very senior, long-standing staff member there, he told me that, if you had said 20 years before that poverty reduction was one of the central mandates of the IMF, you would have been laughed out of the building. But by the early 2000s, that had changed quite significantly. So I wanted to try to understand what was going on, and I quickly realized that this was not just going on at the IMF. It was a much bigger process. It was being driven, if anything, far more by changes at the World Bank, among development agencies, among NGOs, and so on. And so my task, my challenge in a sense, was trying to understand these wider phenomena, not just by studying one or several institutions, but these broader shifts that were taking place. And ultimately I did that through the sort of concept of looking at governance strategies. And I ended up focusing on 4 new governance strategies that had emerged since the 1990s. That is, attempts to foster country ownership, to develop global standards, to manage risk and vulnerability, and to measure results. And together, I argued, these new 4 strategies that we saw being used in different ways and by these different institutions and different actors, but together I concluded they actually formed a different style of governance, a different way of governing that I called a provisional style of governance. And as I was doing this work, I did go back and say, okay, it's easy to say, oh, something's new, everything's different. So I went back and tried to look at, well, how were these same questions and problems studied, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, in sort of the heyday of structural adjustment era. And I concluded, in fact, that that was a different era. It was a much more confident style of governance where people had a sense that they knew where the future was taking them, how they were going, had confidence in their principles and practices. Whereas, again, as I'll talk about in a moment, what we were seeing was a shift to this more cautious, more provisional style of governance. So why this shift? Why did this happen? And this is where the idea of failure comes in. Many have suggested the shift away from structural adjustment was due to the failure of that approach to development, and that was made obvious by some very visible policy failures, the failure of the efforts to reduce poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, the failure of the IMF's response to the Asian financial crisis, and others. But I think what's interesting about these failures is not their objective reality, but the way they were interpreted, the way we perceive them, their kind of subjective reality as failures. So we can think, for example, that the failure of efforts to reduce poverty in sub-Saharan Africa had been flagged in the 1981 Berg report. But at that moment, those failures were seen as the big justification for structural adjustment lending, not as, whereas looking at, in the late 1990s, that same failure was seen as the need to move away from structural adjustment and to start looking at the political and institutional dynamics around development efforts. So these failures, then, I argue, are examples of what I'm calling contested failures. These are the kind of failure that are seen as serious enough that they lead to a wholesale debate about what counts as success and failure. When we really fail and keep failing over and over again, sometimes we ask ourselves, did I get the metrics right? Did I actually teach my students the things that they're now, failing? Do I actually? I don't know if you had that experience. I did once have an experience. I thought, oh my God, I think something went wrong. This exam did not have the results I expected. Or you look at one question that you've asked. Oops. So again, at that moment, you say, okay, it's not just that I know the metrics of what's a pass and what's a failure. I have to rethink it. And in policy terms, these are really interesting moments. And I would argue that the whole aid effectiveness debate in the 90s was exactly that kind of debate that sought to redefine success and failure by broadening beyond economics, by broadening beyond, say, GDP per capita and so on. And so all these new strategies that I look at, ownership, risk management, results measurement, and so on, were ultimately attempts built to build on those new metrics and to deliver a different kind of success. Okay, so I suggested that I see this as a more provisional approach to governance. What does that mean? And I think what we're seeing, the way that governance is being done, and I look here at development, but I've seen this now, I think we're seeing this in other areas as well. The object of development is seen as a more complex one, as a more elusive one. And in response, the efforts to govern are more proactive, they're more preemptive, they're longer term, they're less direct. So for example, rather than simply imposing conditions on economic policy or something, what we see is development institutions trying to shift the institutional context that will lead to better policies, or even empower civil society actors so that they will demand good governance, so that the government will then pursue the policies that are the ultimate objective. Again, the techniques are getting less and less direct, even if ultimately the goals are often very similar. The other thing I think that's interesting about this more provisional style of governance is there's always this much more of an awareness of the possibility of failure. So it is a less confident style of governance that's aware of that sees the world as a less certain place and tries to find ways of governing in that space and in that environment. So just to finish off, why does this matter? This is the question I always ask my graduate students. Actually, I have one who just submitted her thesis today. Yay, PhD thesis. I know, that is remarkable. That is always a great achievement. But I always ask them, and she's done a great job of answering, like the who cares question. So who cares? I think ultimately, for one thing, as I was saying, I think this increasing preoccupation with failure is a wider phenomenon, is itself interesting and important to look at. And in my own work, I've recently started looking at similar trends in terms of recognizing uncertainty, complexity, and so on, and trying to govern differently in the context of financial governance. But I also think that this is interesting because I think it's also important how we respond to failure. When we start seeing and recognizing that failure is a possibility, there are two different ways we tend to go on it. Either we say, oh, I could fail, so I'm going to have to be more open-ended, I'm going to have to learn from failure, I'm going to have to be more experimental, maybe trial and error, I'm going to maybe be more humble because failure is a possibility. And so you see, on the one hand, this sort of more embracing of the possibility of failure, more experimental trend. On the other hand, you could say, I don't want to fail. Failure is a possibility. And so suddenly you become very risk averse, very cautious. You start, again, sort of teaching to the test, ultimately being much more careful and almost cynical sometimes as an attempt to avoid failure. And I think in the context of where development governance has gone, and I would argue in other areas too, we see both of those tendencies. And what I found over the course of my research, because it did take me a while to write this book, was that that we saw more of those open-ended possibilities, I think, at the beginning. And then over time, I think particularly as the results agenda has become increasingly quantitative and increasingly dominant, and people are always trying to measure and essentially govern for results, that I think that has in many ways squeezed some of that creativity out of the system. And I worry a bit about where that's going in the long term. So I think looking at the question of failure and how we govern and try to manage the problem of failure is important, because we have that choice in a sense of how we respond now that we recognize that we live in a less certain time. I will then pass it over to Gordon.
So is this fine? This mic is on? This is what I'm supposed to use? Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks, Jackie. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I also want to really congratulate Jackie on this book. I think it was super insightful. I think it was a really important book because it's written about a very important transitional period in the Bretton Woods institutions, and I think you captured it all really well. Now, I'm particularly interested from a personal point of view because really the period that ultimately this book focuses on, which I would say is sort of the mid to late 90s to post-financial recession, were years that I was at the World Bank, and more than that, I was centrally involved in one of the 4 strategic developments that Jackie wrote about, and that's one of her themes is on the growing acceptance of frameworks that are based on risk and vulnerability. And one of the sectors where that was happening in was the social protection sector. And I was one of the principals in that sector. So I really felt like this was on something that I had a very close personal connection with. So it's kind of strange to read a book about an era where you have been very much part of it, and especially and it was a very complicated organization operating in a very complicated period. And like, I have to admit, like, as I was reading it, part of me was hoping to find out that Jackie just didn't get it. You know, like, even though we had talked about this a few times, and I certainly knew very well Jackie's excellent work on the international financial institutions, but I was really impressed with how she did get it. And the broad debates and the controversies that were going on, and the direction that I can speak much more authoritatively about the bank than the fund, the direction that the bank was heading, I felt that she was definitely hitting it dead on. And this concept of provisional governance that Jackie explained in her opening remarks, I think is a very nice concept to capture what was going on. You have to remember that this was not that far from the days when the bank and the fund were in their glory. Very confident, assertive organizations that had a clear sense of what needed to be done for development and had the institutional power and influence to go ahead and do it. And the period that Jackie's writing about is a period when the reality changes dramatically, and the Bretton Woods institutions become institutions trying to find their way in a very, very different environment. They, in effect, started fighting for space in a market that had new players, and the customers, we call them clients at the bank and the fund, had a great deal of skepticism about the Bretton Woods institutions because of these failures that Jackie talked about, and B, they had other places to go for money and advice with the development of financial markets, the growth of new sources of aid like the foundations, and so the monopolistic environment that the bank and the fund had in the 70s and 80s and early 90s just simply wasn't there. So when you were in the bank in these days that you're writing about, you were no longer going to client countries and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. You were going to client countries and hoping that you could get them to sign on with you, basically. So it was really a very different dynamic going on than was the case in the 70s and the 80s. So I thought Jackie's assessment of all of this was really right on. And not only did she get it right, but I found it really interesting as someone who was in the forest, in the trees at the time. It really helped me to see the forest because, obviously when you're involved in all of this, you're not trying to understand the context and understand the links to the extent that an academic who can go in and look at it can. So I really appreciated a lot of the understandings that I developed by reading the book. So there's a lot of things I can talk about to finish my time up here, but I'm just going to quickly mention 3 things that I think are really important. I'm not saying Jackie did not deal with them. She does deal with them, but I think they're really interesting and important dimensions of this whole period, so I just wanted to put them on the table. One has to do with the intellectual underpinnings of development. A second has to do with people, individuals involved, and the third has to do with practice and the way the IMF and the World Bank do business. So on the intellectual side, this was a period of great uncertainty in these organizations for how they were going to do their business. But underpinning that was uncertainty in the intellectual paradigms that are driving development. So when you go through the history, especially of the World Bank, you can really map their dominant development strategies with the dominant theories of development that had consensus in the academic and research world. Obviously, the clearest illustration of that is the neoliberal fundamentalism that started with the Chicago School and in the US and the UK, and then in continental Europe assembled a lot of consensus that matched up really well with the Washington Consensus and with the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank. So there was this dominant paradigm that guided the bank and the fund, and there was this intellectual underpinning. By the East Asian crisis, that dominant paradigm was starting to really fall apart. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I thought that Danny Roderick, he wrote an article in 2006 called Goodbye Washington Consensus, Hello Washington Confusion. I mean, that really captures what was going on there. So you have this intellectual environment where you don't have the consensus, you don't have the dominant paradigm that you had before. Okay, let me talk a bit about people. I know that as academics, we tend not to look at individuals as determining factors in terms of history, but sometimes they can play a big role. And I feel that especially on the World Bank side, individuals played a decisive role, and if different individuals had been in their places, history might have looked a little bit different. And the 2 people I want to briefly mention are Jim Wolfensohn, who was the president of the bank through most of this period. And let me make a couple of remarks about Wolfensohn. He came to the bank understanding that the old consensus couldn't be held together anymore, that the assertive, confident World Bank was just not going to fly anymore. And he believed that the bank would not survive without fundamental changes. He was very attuned to the criticism going on from the left and the right, and he knew the bank had to change. And he was a larger-than-life character who was able to communicate his vision and able to get a lot of people to buy into it. And then he had Stiglitz. So Wolfensohn didn't pretend to be an intellectual. One of the things that Jackie talks about in her book is kind of the expert authority in the Weberian sense that pervades the Bretton Woods institutions. So that's a place where there's like about 2,000 PhD economists, and you're not going to be able to get them to buy into change unless they feel that those messages are coming from a credible place, and Stiglitz believed that. And Stiglitz was able to really make a big he was a big factor in people questioning the neoclassical underpinnings of the structural adjustment period. The final thing I want to mention as I stop is something about practice. you know, people outside an institution like the World Bank, I think, tend to underestimate the divisions that are going on within the institution. So the chapter that Jackie wrote about risk and vulnerability, there's a lot of talk about the development of this social risk management framework and how that framework becomes one of the pillars of the 2000-2001 WDR, which was a seminal bank document on poverty. But the institution was completely divided about that framework. And in fact, the leadership of the WDR broke apart. Ravi Kambur left early. And the bank is an organization where you have a lot of people quite free to, there's no orthodoxy that everyone has to buy into. And this was really, really evident in the file that I knew about, the risk and vulnerability one. But I was wondering, it would be interesting, I wonder if the consensus that people write about overstates the unanimity of opinion on these things. That's true in the fund, in the bank. It may be much less true in the fund. I'm always reminded of this Martin Wolf article after the East Asian crisis, where he tried to explain how the bank and the fund had reacted completely differently to the crisis. And he said, you have to think about the fund as this unified, cohesive, super efficient Prussian army, and the bank is like the Mexican army as it's depicted in sort of 1950s Westerns, you know. So their cultures are very different in these organizations, and I think that's important for understanding these institutions. Let me just finish with one sentence about where at least the bank is now. Since Jackie's book, I guess, was finished, there's been a fundamental reorganization. President Kim, who came in a couple of years ago, is really trying to restructure, create a new strategy, and I think he should read this book because I think it is the bank even moving farther down this road of provisional governance that Jackie's writing about. Anyway, congratulations and thanks a lot.
Merci. Merci, Gordon. Thank you, Gordon. We're going to pass it on to Randy Germain from Carleton University.
Okay, thank you very much. And like Gordon, I'm delighted to be here. And I have to say, I've been in Ottawa for 10, 11, 12 years now, and every year I thank my lucky stars for, being in the same place that Professor Best is, because not only is she a great scholar and a good scholar, although there, as I will say, there are a few issues to pick at, she's a great kind of booster for IP, and you've helped to transform Ottawa into a real bastion, I think, of critical international play economy. And I also want to say I want to begin with one more little anecdote, because I didn't know this until I first met Jackie. We shared a background. We both went to the University of Victoria, and we probably only shared one professor there, but he was a biggie, Rob Walker. And you ended your remarks with the kind of like, so what's important about this? And I remember a devastating comment. Well, I wrote this second-year essay. Walker was my first introduction to international relations. To anyone who's read his work, you just think, well, if you can survive that, basically you can survive anything. I wrote this big paper on arms deterrence. At the end, he went, interesting paper, so what? That has stuck with me. That was in 1982. That has stuck with me since then. But the so what for this, I say that to kind of head into my first. I have 5 kind of sets of comments on what is really a really crackerjack book. The first is, this is an ambitious book, and it's worth kind of saying that, because not every book that we write is an ambitious book. Sometimes we write a book because we have to write a book. Sometimes we write a book because we want to introduce people to a way of thinking. This book is more ambitious than that. This book actually wants, I think, to leave a bit of a footprint in terms of how we should study something. And it's a way, I think the best, for me, the biggest takeaway of this book is in terms of what it tells us about how to study a subject. In this case, the subject is international financial institutions, and I think that's very important to acknowledge. I think it's also a book that will sell, and even though it's always great to fall asleep at night knowing you've made a contribution to knowledge, it's nicer to fall asleep knowing that there's a few extra dollars in your bank account, so you can spend them on your family. So this is an ambitious book, and I think it will sell well. And for me, the so what question is answered answered in a very positive way. So I'm going to talk about useful, problematic, kind of really interesting, and then kind of where I'm left at the end of it. And for me, you know, the really useful, successful aspect of this book comes in the way that Jackie sets up the way that she's going to study the IFIs. And she has a kind of a triptych of micro, meso, macro. And you could also think there's a kind of a micro discussion of the World Bank. I'm on the macro end, as you'll see, and we'll leave it to William to tie it together at the meso end. But I think that this focus on the meso, on the practice on the middle, is enormously valuable, because what it does is it provides us with a method. And I think, for me, certainly this is the best single example, and I would say this in any audience, of how to do. Okay, I don't know if Jackie would say this is a piece of constructivist scholarship or A&T scholarship or social theory. I don't quite know how you would describe it. I'll just describe it as constructivist scholarship, because for me that's the easiest catch-all category. It's an excellent example of how to do this. And I think the way in which you set out the techniques, and you're very clear about how to explore the different practices and tie in the techniques to the knowledge. I mean, this is, I think, really, really valuable. Certainly for people who read this book and go out, I mean, it provides them with not a blueprint, because we don't do blueprints, but it really provides them with kind of a vision and a map of how to think about doing that. And so for me, that's really an extremely useful thing, and a very significant contribution. So yay on the meso front. But this is not all just backslapping here. The area where I'm still looking to be convinced, is that what Jackie is looking at is actually an undermining of established ontological frameworks. The words ontology, methodology, and epistemology do crop up in the book on a number of occasions, and I'm going to read out two of them in a second. But they're not in the references. I looked. And they're never defined. Now, to me, if one is going to make a claim that there's an undermining of fundamental ontological categories in terms of how development is undertaken, with respect, in this case, to the World Bank and the IMF, less clearly in the IMF. I'm just not convinced about that. Partly because when we think about development, I don't think development is an ontological category. To me, ontology refers to basic units of analysis, if you will, the things out of which a policy like development being practiced by particular sets of actors or agents are constructed. So, if you'll allow me, Professor Best, this is a really well-written book too, by the way. But, so she says, you know, I'm reading from the chapter here on managing risk and vulnerability. Conceptualizing the poor, Jackie says, conceptualizing the poor as mobile transforms poverty from a state of being into a process. This is a new ontology of power. It radically transforms the object of developmental policy, which I agree. She says, to borrow a metaphor from physics, this is like changing our image of the electron from a particle to a wave. But I'm not sure that, in fact, we're dealing with electrons and waves here when we're talking about these basic units of analysis. Or on page 202, I pulled my thing up, but I think it's page 202, which is another really nice thing. Yes, she's talking about, this is in her conclusion, she's talking about where she ended, you know, the two different kind of trajectories, if you will, of governance style. And she says, about provisional governments. In different ways and to different extents, these Two new strategies are attuned to the complexity of the task at hand, recognizing the political, social, and cultural dimensions of economic development. This messier ontology of development finance can lead to a greater awareness, even humility, about the limits of IFI expertise. I'm not convinced that the ontology that the practitioners and the staff of the IFIs is actually being challenged here. I think what they're actually what is being challenged is their epistemological conceptions about how this ontology should be understood and how we ought to develop our categories and our concepts. For me, you should substitute epistemology for ontology there. And this is not, I mean, this is, in terms of the argument that Jackie's making, this has no bearing on it. But it just strikes me that we're not dealing here with a fundamental ontological challenge to an existing order of things. So I'm not convinced on that front. For me, moving on to the next thing I really like about the book, my favorite chapter, I suppose, is the one on measuring results. Because it seems to me that here, you know, the really interesting thing about how institutions are trying to measure their success or their failure, you know, is they're actually, and the book is very good on this, they're really constructing the basis upon which they're going to be judged. And that's pretty interesting, you know. You know, the practitioners are able by building up different metrics are able to lay the grounds for how we're to judge them. And I think this is very problematic. And it seems to me that the methodology that Jackie's employing here and the constructivist approach in general really has something important to say about these metrics. And I think she should deepen that chapter and publish it, send it out to World Politics or to IO, because I think that's, you know, anytime we have a scholar problematizing how we use data, I think we're all for the better here. So I really like that. And my final point with my last minute was I put the book down, I kind of finished reading it, and I said to myself, wow, I feel claustrophobic. I've spent, you know, it takes however long it takes. And I feel very claustrophobic because I've spent all this time deep inside the bowels of I think of a container here of the IFIs. And what puzzled me about this weird feeling of claustrophobia at the end was because, in fact, the process that Jack is describing in this book, which really is about how IFIs are becoming more deeply interventionist in the economies in which they're engaging, more intrusive in their policies. This is a very widespread trajectory in the global political economy. It's a widespread trajectory in how every government is intervening in its economy, and this is, you know, for the very simple reason that liberalization requires, the more we liberalize, the more deeply interventionist we have to become. And so the answer to the question I posed myself about why was I so claustrophobic was ultimately, I think, because, you know, the question about how we explain institutions and institutional behavior, I don't think is one we can answer solely with reference to the institutions themselves, or solely with reference to what the institutions and the agents within the institutions think of themselves. We have to go outside of that. And so for Volume 2 of Governing Failure, what I would love Jackie to do is to step outside the tin can of the IFIs and give us the linkages to the real economy, to the wider world, that show that what she's looking at within IFIs is equally prevalent outside, and that's in fact the world that we all inhabit, which, and I agree with her here, is a world of provisional governance and contingent knowledge.
Merci, Randy. Thank you, Randy. Laisse la parole à William Walters de l'Université Carleton. William Walters.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here to take part in the panel and to pay homage to Jackie for her work, but I also appreciate friendship, which we've had ever since she moved to Ottawa, whenever that was.
Long time ago.
Yes, it feels like that. So I think this is a really special book, and I'll cut straight to the point. My brief was to say a few things that might explore the relationship between the book and some themes in social theory, so that's what I'll do. But if I was to draw up an inventory of the most impressive and significant features of the book, it would include at least the four things. And the first would be, to echo what Randall was saying about the meso, or the middle. I think this research strategy of starting in the middle, or the meso as you call it, but you also call it a level, but I actually think it's also a philosophy. Because if there are no origins in a world of becomings and emergence, then middles are in fact all we have. So I think it's very interesting and suggestive as a way ahead for international relations. This investigation of the irregular shapes, one might call them networks or zones, that are neither global, national, or local. Secondly, a point about failure, the thematization of failure. And I think that, like your earlier engagement with ambiguity, you've shown once more that it's important to tackle themes that cut across the usual way topics are framed in IP and IR, and to grapple with phenomena that might be characterized as moods, experiences, dispositions, or ethicalized phenomena that have a certain affective charge to them. And I think this also sets the book up well for what some people have called a public social science. And of course there are 1,001 books with a title that goes something like Why X Has Failed and How We Can Fix It, but yours is obviously a meta-analysis of failure. And thirdly, a point about the open and the closed. And this focus on experts and practices inside what we take to be some of the most powerful international organizations. And I imagine that access wasn't the easiest thing to negotiate. Ethnographers and anthropologists have for some time pointed out the difficulties and the perils of studying up, and that our knowledges of the social are incredibly skewed by the fact that the lives of the rich and powerful, or their worlds, are much harder to research than the ordinary lives or the poor. So that, social science is really skewed in terms of what it's able to access. And it's true that yours is not an ethnography and doesn't claim to be. But even so, I think in many places you offer really valuable insights about the culture and the sort of organizational power relations and practices inside organizations that we assume to be distant and quite closed. And fourthly, a point about limits. I think your attentiveness to the difficulty of making things technical and inscribed is really important, and as is this concern with fragility. And I think it will help it'll warn other scholars about the dangers of exaggerating the power and proficiency of expertise, while also serving as a model of how to research expertise in a way that puts it in its place, one might say. So in the remainder of my time, I'd like to put on the table an argument about the sociology of intellectual work and production that I've borrowed from Tom Osborne. So this is very much about experts, or it's a way to think about experts. And I do this because I think Osborne's interests seem to have some interesting points of connection and divergence with yours, and it could be a sort of fruitful encounter. And it also gets, I think, at the point Randall was making towards the end there about, how could we sort of connect or think about these transformations that you're talking about within or at the level of these institutions, and then some possibly broader social tendencies in intellectual production, in knowledge work. So Osborne, in the 2004 paper, makes a very interesting argument, which where he builds upon Zygmunt Bauman's work on interpreters and legislators. And I'll very briefly set out a version of his scheme, and then extract 4 questions or points for Jackie and for discussion. So Osborne gives us a 4-fold typology of epistemic forms, which correspond, although not in a one-to-one fashion, with particular types of intellectuals and ethical stylings of knowledge production. So the 4 are interpreters, legislators, experts, and mediators. and very roughly argues that we're seeing the increasing prevalence of mediators, so it's not linear or irreversible. Now I'm going to skip over interpreters. But the legislators are, for Osborne, the grand thinkers, and the archetype would be the philosophe, the Voltaire types. Legislators think on the scale of society as a whole, how it might be ordered and inscribed in macro-historical and anthropo-philosophical processes. I'm not going to say much more about legislators. Experts, I think, these are the kind of intellectual figures that a lot of Foucauldian researchers have kind of privileged and seen in quite a rosy way in a lot of respects. And they're often foregrounded then in studies of modern knowledge regimes and their relationship to governance. Doctors, social inquirers, planners, engineers, architects, economists, names like Robert Moses, Le Corbusier, Beveridge. And perhaps their prestige can be correlated with the modality that Scott called high modernism. They kind of border on the legislator in the sense that they often do articulate an ambitious plan for social reorganization on large scales. But they fit the expert camp just about because they articulate their ideas in a manner that's typically close to particular plans, such as the design of social security or blueprints for Bretton Woods or the project of a common market. So then the third group, mediators, and the sort of simple two-word definition of mediators would be Malcolm Gladwell, but that's to be a bit trite. But the mediator is the intellectual worker as a broker, a fixer, a catalyst of ideas. Mediating not in the spatial sense of coming between positions, but rather in a temporal sense, getting things going, getting the ball rolling, hustling, making things happen. People in the middle of things, creating not from scratch, but by channeling, gathering, remediating, convening, curating. So it's creativity as emergent, it's vehicular rather than oracular, it's profitability rather than prophecy. So it's a notion that ideas are not sort of that valuable or important for their own sake, but for their capacity to travel and to connect. It's knowledge transfer, as Shirk at one point put it. I'm not sure if it's still a privileged category with Shirk. These things change. That's the whole point. There's a lot of dynamism here. The ideas are not eternal, but they sort of move us from one place to another. So it's not the grand narratives, but the ideas will make a difference. Third way, big society, radicalization, end of history, failed states and state building, energy superpower, war on terror, creative class, share economy, tipping point, nudge, Generation X, Y, Z, big shift. Now these sound like sound bites or slogans, and that's kind of partly the point. You know, they are both sound bites and slogans, but also concepts and also often books or projects. And it also sounds like that horrible Billy Joel song that used to, we didn't start the fire, that's a sort of laundry list, you know. Anyway, some comments then to pull out of that. You sort of characterize ideas and governance as being provisional today, as building in a heightened sense of the sort of possibility of failing, lacking the assurance and confidence of these earlier modes. And this does seem to correspond broadly with the kind of shift that Osborne is sketching out towards mediators. But at the same time, his emphasis on mediators suggests another dimension. It's the sort of intensivity, persistence, rapid, fast, disposability, recycling. So the mediators don't hang around. So taken in their aggregate, they don't let failure or disappointment or the collapse of oil prices stop them. So any given individual can sort of experience a sort of trauma or crushing defeat or throw in the towel, but sort of collectively they sort of just forge ahead. So at a sort of societal level, we're looking at what Jessup calls fast policy, an ecology that's sort of dense and pervasive and circumambient. So is it fair to say, this would be my first question, that ideas may have become more provisional and circumscribed, more tentative on one axis, but on another, this is sort of compensated or adjusted by a sort of quickening of the policy ideas cycle? Second point would be Osborne's thinking about public intellectuals a lot, people who sort of editorialize and inhabit a kind of space, think tanks, radio, TV, circuit, university sort of milieu. But does this sort of contrast between mediators and experts have some sort of purchase on the plane that you're looking at, which is much more sort of highly technical, programmatic, institutionalized knowledge production? Does it work when our focus shifts from the kind of university think tank policy-making, informed public sphere world to the more sort of intra and inter-organizational and elite policy-making world that you're grappling with? Third point, there's only one more after this, it would be about amnesia, right? So I think that it's not a point that Tom makes, but I think it's the corollary. So if we live in societies where there's ever more hustling, hyping, and branding of ideas, coupled with failure, does this also require a certain capacity at the level of society to sort of forget? So you sort of put it this way, do we ever sort of go back and ask all those pundits who appeared on TV, you know, within minutes of the bomb going off or within minutes of the tunnel being discovered, making these certain claims and interpretations? Do we ever sort of go back and say, oh, no, actually you were wrong, you know? Do we ever go back and sort of check what pundits might be getting away with? So there's a sort of societal amnesia, and it's kind of organized. It's not just a sort of tendency, but it's ingrained, for example, in the habits of journalists. You know, do journalists sort of do the research and call pundits on it? Well, you were on this show, you know, 2 weeks ago, and you were actually saying this, and now you're saying the opposite. I think a lot of the time they don't. They just let the pundits sort of keep coming up, irrespective of how wrong they've been in the past. And then my final point would be, it's not really about your research area, but it's about national politics in Canada at the moment. It seems to me that it's characterized actually by a sort of paucity, or rather a rarity or a scarcity of ideas, whether we're talking about mediators, legislators, or even experts. So it seems that with the present government, there's a great degree of caution, obviously, about expertise of various kinds, scientific, economic, criminological, ethical. So, you know, some people accuse the Prime Minister of lacking vision or failing to articulate a vision, and I think there's some truth to it. There's a sort of sense that, you know, you don't want to put ideas out in case you sort of get hung by them. So yeah, I just wondered what you'd think about that as well, or what other people would think. So that's it.
Merci, thank you, William. Je pense qu'on va procéder. Merci à tous les commentateurs. But we're going to move to questions. Is that okay, Jack?
Yeah, we'll have a short question and then.
And après, wait, there's some drink and food.